to start today by thanking everyone for coming out. Thank you to my partner, my opponents, and the audience. This is fantastic. We're going to jump right into today's debate. The resolution today is that this House believes that reducing the national debt is more important than policing the world. We're ultimately going to agree with this, and we're going to offer a few definitions. The first definition that we're going to offer is what this House will mean. The government today will be defining this House as the United States. We will also be defining policing the world as a U.S. military presence. We're going to have the criteria today, or how this debate should be judged, based on a cost-benefit analysis. Whichever side can prove that it's more beneficial than costly to support their side of the debate should win today's debate. And our value is going to be utilitarianism. Whichever side can prove the greatest good for the greatest number of people ought to win today's debate. With that being said, let's go ahead and look into our first reason for supporting today's resolution. A growing debt is harmful to our future. Subpoint A, future public investments in the United States are at risk. According to the World Economic Forum in 2019, numerous countries now have better infrastructure than the United States. By not keeping up with the rest of the world, we are not only risking the safety and well-being of our population, we are putting our nation at a competitive disadvantage. What we have to understand is that if we continue to ignore the national debt in the United States, future public investments in research and development, in medical care, in education, these are at risk as long as we continue to ignore this growing crisis. Investment and spending on physical assets such as infrastructure and buildings or equipment and scientific research and such as new cures for cancer and research on the changing climate and education, these will all be at risk. The Congressional Budget Office in 2019 informs us that in the 1960s, total investments in these areas accounted for around 30% of the national budget. This year, it's around 12%. We have continued to see a decrease in investments because of a growing national debt, and that's something we have to understand today. Our subpoint B today is going to be focusing on the safety net, Social Security for our citizens. Continuing to ignore alarming financial projections for critical programs is unacceptable for the United States. The 2019 Social Security and Medicare Board of Trustees report warns that Medicare's hospital insurance fund will be exhausted by 2026, which will affect 73 million Americans. By 2034, old age and survivor insurance trust funds will be exhausted, affecting another 73 million Americans. By 2052, disability benefits and the trust fund there will be exhausted, affecting 13 million more. 56% of all incomes for older Americans in the United States come from Social Security insurance. That's something that we have to understand. As we continue to ignore the growing national debt, it's only further harmful to our citizens right now and in the future. With that being said, let's go ahead and look towards our second contention today. A lack of focus on the national debt will become more expensive for the United States. The subpoint A here is going to be focusing on interest rates for the money that we're borrowing. Interest rates on money borrowed are continuing to rise. The Peterson Foundation argues this on January 6th of 2020, when they say that interest costs were $376 billion in 2019 and are projected to rise to $807 billion by 2029. Over the course of the next decade, interest on the loans that we have borrowed will grow to $6 trillion. We spend nearly as much or more on net interest costs than we do in any other essential areas such as Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, and that is not acceptable. We're not helping United States citizens if we continue to ignore the growing crisis of the national debt. This can be seen further in our subpoint B. Our military presence globally is extremely expensive. There are 200,000 U.S. troops stationed at hundreds of bases in countries and territories outside of the United States. And according to the Watson Institute of International and Public Affairs at Brown University, since 9/11, American taxpayers have spent $6.4 trillion on wars and military action in the Middle East and Asia alone, with total investments and interest accounting for just $6 trillion. By focusing more on the growing national debt instead of our military presence, it's more beneficial to the United States and it's more beneficial to the globe as a whole, which is why we have to look at our third and final contention today. A United States military presence leads to destabilization and harms communities of people around the world. The subpoint A here is that the United States military presence is destabilizing governments, and we'll look at a couple of examples. First and foremost is Iraq. According to Foreign Affairs in 2019, 9 years after U.S. troops toppled Saddam Hussein, the country has become something close to a failed state. The Iraqi state cannot provide basic services, including regular electricity in summer, clean water, and decent health care. Meanwhile, unemployment among young men hovers close to 30%, making them easy recruits for criminal gangs and militant factions. The United States went in without a plan. The United States has a military presence, and we have destabilized a government like this. But we see it all the time. We have continued to allow people to take advantage of this region, and it's not beneficial. Another example of this is Vietnam. During the Vietnam War, when we had a military presence, we only further destabilized the governments, not just of South Vietnam, but of North Vietnam as a whole because of bombing campaigns. The United States only further destabilizes regions when we focus on our military presence and not on our national debt. This can be seen further in our subpoint B. A U.S. military presence is actually harmful to individual communities, and we'll look at two more examples here as well. First is Saudi Arabia. According to Chicago University's Robert Pate, the principal cause of suicide terrorism is resistance to foreign occupation. Indeed, the presence of U.S. military bases in Saudi Arabia was one of the most prominent grievances cited by Al-Qaeda pre-9/11. And since the surge in U.S. military presence in the region post-9/11, terrorist attacks on troops and bases in the Middle East have dramatically increased. The United States only further destabilizes countries, but also harms the communities as we continue to see this issue of terrorism in the region. But we're also seeing this in military bases like the ones in Okinawa, Japan. America cannot be the world's cop. No country, not even the world's only superpower, can be the policeman of the entire planet. And we've seen the harms that this causes to communities. In Okinawa specifically, U.S. soldiers at the military base have been charged of raping people in those communities. They have been charged of harming the citizens, unlawfully jailing them, and they have caused more problems than they have done good for the country. So it is for the reasons that the growing national debt is harmful to our future, that a lack of focus on the debt will become expensive for the United States, and that our military presence is destabilizing and harmful to communities, that we strongly urge you to vote for the pro in today's debate. Thank you.
Right ahead with our case. So my partner and I stand in opposition of the resolution. This House believes that reducing the national debt is more important than policing the world, and we are going to offer some counter definitions as to why you should prefer Juliana and I's definition over what the affirmation has brought for you today. We agree with the definition of this House, but we are going to argue a counter definition of we are defining policing the world as promoting global security. Whereas the AF mainly focuses on military presence, we are going to focus on increasing global security in both economical as well as military terms. So the value that we are going to do, we're going to focus on general welfare, because when you prefer general welfare over utilitarianism, you get minorities in there too. Utilitarianism focuses on the majority, so by using general welfare, you get a lot more minorities that aren't necessarily as represented in the majority. And our value, our criteria, we also are going to agree with cost-benefit analysis, whichever side can prove more benefits than costs. So I'm going to go right into our case before making some responses to what John had said. So the first contention that we have opposing this resolution is the threat of an economy crash. So what we can see here is that subpoint A is that the safety net will actually crumble, because what we see is from the balance from February 2020, they explain that much of the U.S. debt is owed to foreign, many people believe that much of the U.S. debt is owed to foreign countries. However, a lot of the U.S. debt is owed to Social Security and pension funds. So this means that a lot of U.S. citizens, through their retirement money, they own a lot of the national debt. The public holds $17.1 trillion of the national debt. And so what we can see here is that a lot of contribution to the national debt is through retirement funds. What we actually see further from a New York Times article from February 2020, 62% of the national debt focuses on those pension and Social Security programs, while only around 18% focuses on military around the world. So when the government gets up here and tells you that we need to focus on decreasing military because that will help, it won't, because it's not nearly as significant as social programs and the welfare of people within the United States. So when we focus on affecting that national debt, that safety net and those retirement plans are going to crumble. But some point B that we have here with an econ crash is that this is going to affect the global economy. The United States has an immense influence, our economy, on the global economy, because our economy is doing fairly well. Specifically, what we see here is that American consumers are driving the global economy because we have such a big impact on Japan and China. Japan and China are cool with us. The aforementioned balance article from February 2020 explains that actually Japan owned $1.15 trillion of the U.S. debt, and then China owns $1.07 trillion of the U.S. debt. And essentially, this is beneficial to their countries because it keeps the value of the dollar higher than the value of their currencies, which overall positively impacts their exports to their country and exports from the United States. So what we see here is that Japan and China are actually helping. They are being benefited from the U.S. economy as it is right now, and that in turn helps the entire global economy because Japan, China, and the United States all have pretty big economies that all affect the global economy as a whole. But the second argument I'm going to go into here for contention 2 is going to be the U.S. debt sustainability. Our subpoint A here is that the national debt is not really an immediate threat. So essentially, we can look to Japan's GDP to national debt ratio. At the highest point in their economic growth, they were at a 236%, while still maintaining a strong growing economy. So the ratio of how much we are spending versus the economy isn't necessarily a great indicator to what's actually at stake with the economy right now. And we can actually see from a CNBC article from July of 2019 that the U.S. Is officially in its longest expansion, breaking the record of 120 months of economic growth from March 1991 to March 2001. So even though we have a high debt, that doesn't necessarily reflect on how the economy is performing. Subpoint B here is that the national debt is irrelevant because when we focus on bringing down this national debt, that overall takes away from issues that are an immediate threat to us right now. As I said earlier, the U.S. economy is doing fine. We're in the longest expansion in history, and what we can see here is that from a Conversation article, Venezuela's debt was only 23% of its GDP in 2017, yet its economy has been in turmoil for several years. So even though they have a low national debt, that doesn't necessarily mean their economy is thriving, and so that's not a great indicator. Our contention 3 is that we need to prioritize global security, and this goes back to what I was saying about how we need to focus on immediate threats. Subpoint A is environmental security. A Foreign Affairs article from July of 2019 explains that climate change actually affects people right now. It's a lot more prevalent and a lot more relevant than national debt. Because what we see here is that a lot of those countries that are not as developed as the United States and that are struggling, they are being affected by climate change a lot more than we are. So if we prioritize global security and helping people rather than necessarily military defense, we'll be able to go on and help these countries that are struggling environmentally, and overall that promotes the entire environment because the environment is not exclusive to a single country. So when we focus on those issues, overall that's going to help us. Subpoint B here is that the coronavirus threat is higher right now than the national debt. Because what we see here is that most of the economic, from a MarketWatch article from 2020, we see that a lot of the impact on the U.S. economy is coming from the coronavirus because it leaves a lot of people not being able to necessarily support themselves through medical care. And so what we see is that this leaves the U.S. manufacturers and retailers without the goods they need. And so what that does is it causes an immense harm on the supply side of the economy, not the demand side. And that's going to make it very hard for people to get the basic goods that they need and overall want. But finally, within my last minute, I'm just going to go over some brief responses to their case. So what we're going to see here is their contention 1 about public investments. What we see here is that if we focus on, you can cross-apply this to subpoint B as well. When we focus on affecting this national debt, most of the top 10% of America, that's who the national debt focuses on. So that's overall going to cause a lot of the top 10% to put in, they won't put the money into public investments. They're going to focus that on the stock market, and that's not going to help middle and working class citizens. So overall, that's not going to go into the economy in an effective way. Contention 2, essentially what we see is that the interest rates have been cut for several years, subpoint A, and so what we essentially see is that that's not proven to affect rising debt. So for these reasons, I can only see a vote for opposition in today's ballot.
Alright, since this is my first and only speech, thank you everyone for coming. We really appreciate your presence here. It's going to be a really big difference for us. So first of all, I want to talk about this definitional debate where we're just defining policing the world as U.S. military presence, and they're defining policing the world as promoting global security because they're framing policing as the negative not having enough ground because policing is aggressive. Well, we're essentially saying that promoting global security is an extension of our definition, which is the U.S. military presence, because promoting global security says that there has to be an enforcer. How do you promote global security without this hard force? And we're saying this hard force is the U.S. military presence. So this is essentially an extension of our definition. So we would subsume that definition as well, because U.S. military presence is necessary to promote this global security. And then moving on to this value debate that we have, we're saying that the value here should be U.S. Utilitarianism, the greatest good for the greatest amount of people. And they're saying the value should be general welfare. However, how do you measure general welfare? Utilitarianism is the best way to do this because we're able to weigh out in this debate the greatest good for the greatest amount of people. We are arguing solely that the U.S. should not be militarily involved. We're not saying that the U.S. should not be involved economically or politically around the world, but they should not have a military presence. Because we're going to be arguing in this debate that they're doing more harm than good by having this military presence. On their contention one, where they're saying that there's going to be an economic crash, the economic crash is more likely if we police the world. As my partner said in contention one, subpoint A, over the past decade, we spent $6.4 trillion on our military presence around the globe in 80 countries around the world. Our biggest problem with the U.S. national debt is this interest, over the next 10 years, this $6 trillion in interest that we will have. If we don't have that military presence around the world, we have that $6 trillion that we can put back into the national debt, put back into Social Security, and into these programs that benefit the most amount of Americans today. So we can only focus on protecting the safety net if we're focusing on the national debt. And the reason why the safety net is in danger is because we're not focusing on the national debt currently. By turning away from military presence, we have the means to pay for this national debt. So their argument completely falls and turns to us because we will see an increase to the funds in Social Security with the decrease of the military presence. On to contention two, the sustainability of the U.S. debt. We can cross-apply again, number one, where the national debt hinders the ability to invest to secure our citizens. These are all wiped out with the national debt. They can say this all they want, but sustainability is not true. We have seen this historically, that they're talking about post-World War II, there was this boom of the economy. However, post-World War II, we were not as involved as we are today in the military. So this argument completely falls because we weren't the same place today. So this contention completely falls and turns the affirmative because the national debt has a negative effect on citizens and not a good one. And they're talking about Japan, but Japan also is not applicable because they're not involved around the world like the United States is. They're actually in their constitution, it says that they're not allowed to be an aggressor. They have a military that only is in place to protect themselves in case of attack. And the economy here is working only for the wealthiest people. So when they're saying that the national debt, the biggest amount of the national debt is on people who are on Social Security, but then they're turning and saying that the economy is doing great, but it's only helping the top 10%. And they're also talking about Venezuela, and Venezuela has a low national debt, but they're in turmoil. However, Venezuela's economic turmoil has nothing to do with their national debt. It has to do with their authoritarian regime, with corruption, and with the fall of oil prices. And then number three, the priority on global security. Basically the U.S. is in a position to help, so they should, in regards to climate change and in regards to crises around the world. However, if the United States does not focus on the national debt, we will not be able to have the means to help climate change, and then they talk about the coronavirus, but the coronavirus is a threat to the national debt because the government and Social Security and social services will have to be carrying the burden of coronavirus and the health crisis that's going to in turn happen. So essentially we are not arguing today that we need to withdraw from international affairs altogether. We're just saying we need to withdraw our military presence. We're saying it's more harmful to U.S. citizens and the United States as a whole if if we were to have this military presence. As we said in our contention 3, that we are destabilizing regions around the world. We're not doing any good by having this military presence. What happened in Iraq, we went in there to take out Saddam Hussein, but we didn't have a plan after that. We left the country, and we left the country in shambles. In Okinawa, we have our base there, and we're harming people. And we're there, and we're putting people in conflicts that they don't have any business in being in. For example, in Iraq, with the airstrike against Soleimani, it's a problem between U.S. and Iran. Why should Iraqi citizens, why should Iraqi territory and their sovereignty be harmed? And same thing with Okinawa. If China or North Korea were to attack the United States, they do it right there. They do it in Okinawa. Why should Okinawa suffer because of our issues? And then going back over our case, they were able to hit our first contention by saying that the national debt focuses on the top 10%. However, they also said in their case that most of the debt is on Social Security. So that's not the top 10%. Most of the debt today is held in the social services that, like my partner had said, 68% of the national debt is used for our elderly people. This is where their main source of income is. So for this reason, I strongly urge for an act ballot in today's meeting. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you for everyone coming to this debate today. We're really glad to see a lot of faces in a full room. This is fantastic. Thank you to my partner for helping me create a great case, and thank you for the opposition for creating a great clash. But we have a lot to get over, so let's go ahead and start. I'm going to go ahead and start with this House believes. So this House believes that we should basically focus on reducing the national debt rather than policing the world. Now we have a few key definitions that we have to come into play here. The first one is going to be policing the world. The government side said policing the world should be U.S. military presence. We disagree. It should be global security because you can police the world through other means other than just the military, such as economic sanctions, humanitarian aid. You can do different things throughout military presence, but also policing the world doesn't just come from the military itself. Therefore, their argument saying that policing the world and military presence subsumes arms is not true, because military presence does not deal with economic sanctions nor humanitarian aid, which is what we will be advocating for the negative side in today's debate. Next, we will go on to the value debate as well. They say that that utilitarianism is a better measuring force. And then they asked us, how will we measure general welfare? Well, I will tell you, we will measure general welfare through happiness and less poverty and equal treatment. That's how we will measure general welfare, and this will apply to everyone, not just the majority. Moving on from this, we will go ahead and attack the government's case. First, their first contention is that a growing debt is harmful to our future. But as we have seen throughout our contention too, the U.S. debt is completely sustainable. Considering Japan had the largest economic growth and they had a 236% debt-to-income ratio, the United States debt is also sustainable. During the largest economic boom of the United States, the post-World War II economic boom, our actual GDP was over 130%, our GDP to debt ratio. Right now, it's still under 100%, at 92%. But considering our largest economic boom had the GDP debt ratio at 130%, we can see that it's actually extremely sustainable. The GDP percentage and ratio is incredibly important to see that it's not valid as an economic idea, which leads us to our contention saying a growing national debt is actually not harmful to our future, but reducing it is. Because when we reduce the national debt, the first thing we have to do is make cuts to social programs, such as Medicare, Medicaid, and Social Security, which own 62% of the national debt. These will be the first programs cut if we reduce the national debt, which can create an economic collapse and more poverty for people in the future and an erasure of the middle class, and eventually the United States could actually fall into an economic crisis because there's not enough circulation in the economy and most people are doing unfairly. We saw this during the 2008 housing crisis that directly affected a majority of the population. A lot of the people in this room right now were also affected by the 2008 housing crisis and economic bubble. So what we can see here is if we start cutting these social programs and reducing the national debt, that also leads to less government spending, which is a huge key in today's debate as well. We must look at government spending as something that actually promotes the economy. But when there is less government spending, there's also less money circulating in the economy, which leads to another economic crisis. So we can see that the growing national debt is not harmful to our future, but reducing it is, making the decreasing over time, making this entire subpoint invalid because it's simply based on irrelevant information. Moving on to their subpoint B, that military presence is globally expensive. The response I have to this is that this is a non-unique argument. Military presence across the world for China and Russia is also expensive, but they still continue to do it as well, and they still continue to push their influence. And these powers can also get influence in areas and support government regimes, such as Bashar al-Assad in Syria, and support civil wars and conflict across the region. The United States must act in situations like this to prevent people from dying in the regions. And considering that we are ignoring these conflicts, it is imperative that we start getting involved in policing the world in order to save civilians' lives in areas such as Syria and Yemen. Moving on to their contention 3, that U.S. military presence leads to destabilization. This may be true, but we also have to look at how U.S. military presence can also increase stabilization over time. A great example of this is in Germany after the Holocaust. The United States went in to prevent more atrocities from happening in the Holocaust. By doing this, they actually saved people's lives and helped rebuild the country of Germany from a Nazi fascist state to one of the largest democratic states we have right now. Similarly, we can see this furthermore through how we use economic aid and humanitarian aid to build up countries. Currently, we are sending humanitarian aid to Yemen in order to combat the famine crisis. So through this, we can see that U.S. military presence may destabilize governments, but it also becomes necessary in situations. Because if we did not remove Saddam Hussein or Muammar Gaddafi from Libya, they would have committed a genocide against their own people. So this is the reason why we have to focus on global security as a whole. Moving on to their subpoint, moving on back onto our case, is that the economic crash, as I previously stated, reducing the national debt will create an economic clash. That can affect global security as a whole. Considering that the global economy is intertwined, the United States federal economy itself is one of the pillars that holds it together. During the 2008 housing crisis, multiple economies across the world crashed as soon as the housing bubble in the United States crashed, creating a worldwide global recession. Moving on to our point about U.S. debt sustainability. Considering that the United States national debt is sustainable over time, we can see it's non-issue. But what is an issue moves us to our contention 3, environmental security. Currently, we are seeing one of the most worst environmental policies and worst environmental crises in our entire history. We need to focus on situations like this because this directly affects global security. If we are not having enough resources or land, or we are burning up literally and our oceans are flooding our cities, there is no global security. So we must combat climate change over reducing the national debt because it is a more serious issue and it is going to end up killing us all if we do nothing about it. Moving on to our subpoint B, that the coronavirus threat is a higher economic threat than than the national debt itself. The coronavirus has recently made the stock market very volatile. It's randomly dropping and falling and rising. I don't know what's happening with it, but it's crazy. Either way, the coronavirus is directly affecting the global economy as well. So what the United States does is has to stand up and use its economic power and also some of its military policing in order to prevent this from creating a global disaster. Considering our national debt won't do anything to the global economy, we have to focus on things that will do things to the global economy, such as coronavirus. Overall, considering that the national debt is irrelevant and we have more issues to focus on that leads us to policing the world, we have to vote for the opposition in today's debate.
Okay, it's your turn now. So remember, we vote with our feet. We're midway through. So if you're in support of the government, sit on this side. If you're in support of the opposition, sit on that side. Go ahead, don't be shy. Move around, I'll give you a minute. While you're moving around, I'm going to invite you to make some speeches. We're looking for people to make 30-second to 1-minute speeches, either in support of the resolution, in opposition of the resolution, or just a neutral speech where you make statements pro and con. Once everybody gets it, this is great. Okay, who would like to make the first speech? You can do it from your seat or you can come to the microphone. Up to you. Somebody that would like to speak in support of the topic. Is there somebody that would like to make a speech negating the resolution, not supporting? Somebody that would like to make a speech supporting the opposition side? This does not look like a shy group.
Give a speech, give their opinion.
Give your opinion, yes. Anybody? Oh, there we go, okay.
You two on the end, have either of you ever served in the military? Okay. first speaker, you made several citations in your speech stating about the detrimental effect that military servicemen have on people of the countries that they're stationed at. Is this first-hand information, second-hand information, or hearsay?
This is firsthand based on the court documents.
And are you aware of any of the atrocities that the peoples in these countries perform against military service members?
Yes, I am.
And why was that not cited in there?
Our focus is on reducing the United States military presence specifically. So if that helps service members by not having atrocities committed against them, then that's a further example of why we need to leave these areas.
And one other point, what did you say that the military budget was, or what military expenditures are?
Since 9/11, it's $6.4 trillion.
And how much has the United States spent on providing foreign aid to other countries and providing aid to undocumented Americans?
Hundreds of billions.
So if we stop that, that kind of negates the other one, doesn't it? Or it helps the issue.
And that's time for that speech. Thank you. That's good. Okay, this is good. Timed everybody out in a minute. If I let it go a little bit longer, because that was so fun. Anybody else want to make a speech? Yes.
I'd like to say that, the idea of military service, you could add the idea that it's inherently unequal because we don't have a draft. So people from lower income classes tend to take the burden.
Good. Thank you. Others? Yes, in the back.
I have a few questions for everyone. First, I was wondering if, because I know that the military creates lots of jobs, I guess, and so that would affect the economy. So I was wondering why that wasn't thought of at all. And I was also wondering about decreasing military presence and how that affects nuclear threat from the Cold War and stuff.
That's an excellent example. I'm actually glad that you brought that up because the United States military presence is one of the major deterrents in actually nuclear proliferation. For example, in Iran, we have high sanctions on them, and also we have bases kind of surrounding Iran to prevent them from creating nuclear weapons, and we have a similar situation going on in North Korea with our bases in South Korea.
Great. Thank you. Do we have any other people? Yes.
I've just got one comment about the coronavirus. I think, and this is not necessarily my thing, but the stock market is influenced by a lot of hearsay and fear, false evidence, appearing real, whatever. And the whole thing about the coronavirus is that it only has a mortality rate of 2%. And once this information gets out, people realize it's not as deadly as the flu, really. People will start, becoming a little bit more, casual when it comes to the stock market. It will stop being so volatile as it goes on, and it's not really as much of a threat as we think. So that's what I guess.
Great. Other people that would like to speak?
I would disagree with that, but I believe the best the numbers right now is the flu is 0.1%. Another thing, I'm confused by the reframing of policing.
Yeah.
Because when you reframe it in that way, that one side's military presence, which can be very insulting for other countries. I mean, if there was another military in the United States, we'd be incredibly insulted. And then when you say it's support and giving money to other countries, it just confuses me because I agree with both. So I don't understand how that
The magic
works.
of debate.
Thank you. And I saw a hand in the back in the red.
I support the Christian military person because we enter North Korea, we want to sanction them and everything, but North Korea is still testing weapons. So I feel like if we're in the situation what we're doing doesn't really make sense, I just feel like we should withdraw back everyone, just come back home, please. I'm sorry. I'm just saying.
Audience, this was wonderful. Thank you. Thank you. Oh, we have one last speech. Yes.
For the gentleman, you stated that monies would be best spent towards education. I'm a Webster graduate thanks to the military.
This was so wonderful. Thank you, audience, for your participation. We love it. Okay, we're going to finish the debate. We'll welcome John Wallace back. Laurel Kratzback.
All right, this is my last speech, so just thank you everyone so much for coming. This was a lot of fun. Thank you to everyone who prepped the debate and is participating. So I am going to present three issues that you guys should be voting on today for why the negative has won today's debate. And so I'm going to get right in with the first voter of the definition. My partner and I had got up here and said that we should be defining policing the world as promoting global security. And essentially, weighing this debate on global security is going to apply to our criteria of cost-benefit analysis extremely well, because when we weigh this debate on global security, how secure environmental issues are as well as other global economies, that's going to cause the most benefits for every player involved, not just the United States. So what we see here is that we should focus then also on that global security as well as general welfare, because general welfare allows us then to focus on not just the majority, such as utilitarianism. So by weighing this debate on global security and general welfare, you can then overall see what's going to impact the global economy as well as the global environment the most, based on how this helps the most amount of people, and as my partner mentioned, poverty. So essentially what we see here is that if you buy that definition, if you agree with that definition, my partner and I, the negative, have already won today's debate. But I'm going to go into my second vote here of prioritizing global security specifically on issues that are more immediate threats than the national debt. The United States is in a position to help the global economy. We are in a position to help environmental issues. We are in a position to help struggling countries, so we should. So essentially what we see here is that we shouldn't necessarily focus on the national debt, because that's not as relevant as a lot of the other human rights violations and environmental impacts that are happening around the world. If we are in a position to help those people, we should prioritize that more than our own national debt. And as my partner and I brought up in our speeches, we have had a national debt for a while, and we will have a national debt for 10 years into the future. The national debt is going to be around, but a lot of these issues that are affecting and killing people right now, they are the things that we need to focus on, not necessarily what's going to be around now as well as in the future. So essentially what we also see with this voter issue is, as my partner mentioned, we stepped in with Germany and Iraq to help genocides. When we can actually focus on helping people in those countries, that's going to be more beneficial, and that weighs into the cost-benefit analysis criteria that both sides brought up, that overall creates more benefits. And then finally, going into my third voter issue of simply that the national debt is a non-issue. We brought up examples of Venezuela and Japan saying that how high or low the national debt isn't necessarily a good indicator for how well the economy is doing. And so what essentially we see here is that this is not necessarily, just because it's at a pretty high point, that's not necessarily extremely critical in our own welfare in the United States as well as around the world. So overall, we have to focus on immediate harms. And the fact that the national debt has been around for a while, and the simple fact that it's going to continue to be around, a fact that not anyone can really disagree with, shows that the negative has won today's debate, because we should focus on global security and immediate threats over America's current national debt. So what we see here is that when we focus on the immediate harms, we are able to affect those crimes happening around the world to both American citizens as well as global citizens. So what we see here through these three voters, the first voter of the definition of weighing the debate on global security and what benefits the most amount of people over the most amount of countries, prioritizing this global security to overall take care of issues that are affecting countries right now, as well as the fact that the national debt is simply a non-issue because it's going to be around for a while, shows that these three voters show that there's only a vote in negation in today's debate.
I just want to give a last blanket of thank yous to everyone. I'm the last voice that you're going to hear, so I'm sorry. If you leave Webster University and go about 4.5 hours south and west in Missouri, you'll reach my hometown of Neosho. And in that city, we have a poverty rate that is higher than the state average, higher than the national average. It's around 23%. If the con comes up here and tells you that the economy is working for everyone, I would ask you to go there and ask them. Because yeah, it's doing well for the top 10%, the top 1% in the United States, but for the people like my grandfather, my mother, and my grandmother who has now passed away because she didn't get the help she needed, it's not working for them. The national debt is one of the largest issues that we have to focus on, and that's why we have 4 key voters today. The first one is the definitional debate about global security. Now they're talking about being involved economically and helping other people around the world. We're not saying we shouldn't help people. We're saying that our military presence is more harmful. And when we look at the idea of global security, that includes a military presence. And if it's harmful to global security in any form, then that's what we have to focus on. Our military presence is more harmful to the people for the regions that we're in. It's more harmful to our service members. That's something that we have to address. That's why reducing our military presence and focusing on the national debt is so important. Let's go ahead and look at the second voter issue today, and that's going to be the idea of the cost-benefit analysis. It's more costly to ignore the national debt. We've seen that over the next 10 years, it's going to grow. The interest rate for for their loans that we have is going to increase by $6 trillion. It's more costly to continue our presence in regions where we're hurting people, like Iraq, like Okinawa. They want to talk about how we need to help these people, and we can. But we're not doing it with our military presence. We cannot police the world if we're only harming them and harming ourselves. But we also have to understand that it's more beneficial for us to decrease our military presence, to focus on the national debt, and focus on those issues that are important to everyday Americans. Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, all of these things are further harmed when we ignore the national debt. The third key voter issue today is that of the utilitarianism and general welfare argument. We can't help the greatest number of people if we don't focus on our national debt that's growing out of control. They can tell you they don't know what's going on with the economy. Well, I can tell you when I go back home, I see what it's doing to the people of Neosho, Missouri. I see what it's doing to the people across this state and across this nation. If we continue to ignore the national debt, it's going to grow to epic proportions, and it's going to further harm the people of the United States. That's not something that we can risk. That's not something I'm willing to risk. They say that they're going to measure general welfare by happiness, decrease in poverty, and equal treatment. My grandfather's not happy when he gets his food stamps cut, when his Social Security check increases. My mother's not happy when she lives in poverty and her son has to rely on massive amounts of student loans just to get through college. My grandmother is dead because she didn't get equal treatment from the doctor who believes men over women. The general welfare of this population is not helped if we continue to ignore the national debt. And it's not benefiting the greatest number of people in the United States and across the world. The fourth and final argument here is an analysis of the 2 different sides of today's debate. In the world of the con, we continue to have a military presence that is only further harmful to the United States service members and the people in the regions that we're in. We're going to see future harms to public investment. We're not going to be able to afford to take care of research and development. We're not going to be able to take care of research into the effects of climate change. And we're not going to be able to focus on environmental security if we don't focus on reducing the national debt. We cannot help our nation, the people, and the people of the world if we continue to ignore that problem. And in the world of the pro, we decrease our military presence, helping the people across the world. We increase public investments because now we're focusing on reducing that debt, which gives us the ability to pay for these things. And we see greater benefits to all people in the United States. For that reason and many more, I strongly urge you to vote for the pro.
Okay, before we split the audience and declare a winner, I want to thank you all for coming. This is wonderful. The room is full. We did it. Thank you. We're so thrilled you're here. Huge thank you to the debaters that debated today. Hope you enjoyed it. I think they did a nice job making the topic fun. So now it's your turn. Everybody on your feet. If you're in agreement with the affirmative side, please come to this side of the room. If you're in agreement with the opposition side, please go to that side of the room. I'm going in Sitting or standing is fine.
Well, now the other one is sick. Okay.
Sitting or standing is fine. Just the dividing line is the middle. Okay, gosh. It's close. It's really close to me. But I think we will declare the government the winner today. Thank you all. Please take a moment to speak to the debaters. There's drinks, cookies, water, soda. Please help yourselves, and thank you all again for coming.